This is Tim Staten with Tim Stating the Obvious. What is this podcast about? It's simple. You are entitled to great leadership everywhere you go, whether it's to church, whether it's to work, whether it's at your house, you are entitled to great leadership. And so in this podcast, we take leadership principles and theories and turn them into everyday, relatable, and usable advice.
And a quick disclaimer, this show, process, or service by trademark manufacturer, otherwise does not necessarily constitute an implied endorsement of anyone that I am employed by or favors them in representation. The views are expressed here in my show are my own expressed and do not necessarily state or reflect those of any employer.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode. I'm really excited about today's episode in particular because we have a special guest with us talking about something that's near and dear to my heart because we have this show is social media and podcasting. And specifically, she's going to be talking about social media with senior leaders and kind of ways to help us get around things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Jess real quick. So Jess Jensen is a communication strategist, digital marketer, and entrepreneur. She's an advocate for servant leadership and a believer in fostering meaningful connections in a digital first world. For over 20 years, Jess has shaped how leaders communicate, helping them inspire, clarify, and elevate their voice. Today, she leads CoPilot Communications, a company that she founded in 2024 to help executives and ambitious founders leverage digital communications and channels like podcasting and social media to bring optimism, inspiration, and humanity into conversations, shifting the focus towards progress and positive change. What's most important is her number one goal is to sharpen and elevate a leader's professional brand so they can use their influence for good, which I think is incredibly important. Previously, Jess held leadership roles in Microsoft, Adidas, and Nestle, where she honed her expertise in brand marketing, with 7 of those years working directly with C-suite on their digital comms platform. During her decade at Qualcomm, she led the company's worldwide digital communications practice, gaining deep insight into the corporate strategy and storytelling. Jess holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and an MBA, and serves on the board of a nonprofit, Imperfectly. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and her 2 daughters. And outside of work, Jess enjoys supporting local restaurants, cycling and hiking through scenic highways, scenic Pacific Northwest, and exploring the region's many delicious Pinot Noirs. So Jess, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. It's good to be here.
I'm glad we were able to make this happen. I don't know what the weather is like where you're at, but I know up here you're in the Northwest. I'm in the Northeast. It's kind of cold and chilly. It's very sunny out today, which is good. So before we dive into the topic of social media, I think it's really important that everybody's on the same page with what are we talking about when we talk about social media. So can you just kind of define what social media is and the purpose of why, from a business perspective, we should be engaged in that?
Sure. Social media is such a broad set of channels today. So it includes everything from kind of our OGs like Facebook, Twitter /X, also Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, which is a big one for a lot of senior leaders. And there are a myriad of newer platforms like Blue Sky that are popping up. So there is really not one social media. There is this portfolio that you might almost use the analogy of when you invest in like a mutual fund. You're buying a basket of stocks. When you get involved with social media, you often are dabbling in multiple platforms and selecting ones that really complement each other. So social has been around, I think most of us know, for 15 plus years, which is crazy. And I've been fortunate enough to be in roles at companies where I was able to take some risks and experiment pretty early on, going back to 2007. And so I've really grown up professionally alongside the growth and expansion of social. And I've seen it move from being very much a personal thing, an individual thing, then to consumer brands who really adopted it early. And now over, again, a decade plus, B2B or business to business, kind of more enterprise level companies are using it. So really now everyone is using it as a tool to communicate what their company stands for, product launches, the points of view of senior leaders, and really just to round out their overall marketing and communications portfolio.
Which I think that's a great definition to get us kind of honed in on to how do we as senior leaders of any organization leverage digital communication and everything else to really, one, connect with people and bring humanity back into the space.
Yeah. And I'm glad you used that word humanity. I love that word. I think if we rewind the clocks a little bit back to say 2018, 19, pre-pandemic, at that point, if you were a C-suite, VP, senior leader, founder, and you were not on a digital property, not on a social property, that was beginning to be fairly conspicuous, right? Most people were active in some form or fashion. Fast forward to today, now 2025, and over 2/3 of senior leaders of US-based companies have a social media presence, over 2/3. So it is now more common than not for them to be there. Now, how are they showing up? That's goes back to the word that you just used, humanity. Some of them are doing a fantastic job. And there's some examples I can share later if you're interested in who I follow and learn from. But there's a lot of leaders, and I understand why, and we can get into that, who have begun to use social and digital platforms effectively how we've traditionally used PR platforms, which is to say that it's a bit one way, so kind of broadcast versus a back and forth and a conversation, which social enables if you choose to leverage it for that. And also maybe not as authentic, not as true to who they are as whole people, and a little bit more sort of polished corporate kind of speaking in a way that one might in a press release, and just using digital channels to do the same thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about that part a little bit, because I know we come from two different worlds, right? So I come from a military background where if for a senior leader to get on social media, it could cost them their careers. And so how can we make sure that we set out a good framework to make sure that senior leaders stay in line, they don't go off script? And not every organization has like a public affairs team or anything else like that, especially if you're a smaller business. So what is a framework that we can use to get us into a safe space to be more confident and get out as a senior leader, get the messaging out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first and foremost, I would start with, and again, depending on the size of the company you're in, this may or may not exist, but many of the companies I've worked for, I actually would collaborate with our legal team, and we would develop a social or a digital media guidance or rubric, and it would be published to all of the employees. It was sort of a set of rules of the road, sort of things to do and things not to do. And so I think first stop would be ask probably your communications team, perhaps your legal team, does that exist? And if it does, my gosh, let's make sure we know what that says and we follow those rules. If it doesn't exist, that's actually an opportunity to begin to forge that, because once things are written down, it's a lot easier for everyone to stay in line, not just senior leaders. But beyond sort of the do's and don'ts, kind of the black and white rules that might be established, there are often, I talk about 5 ways that a leader can use digital to really bring to life their personality and also their business. Because again, this should be of service to your team, your business, as well as to you as a person, right? It should be both. And so I can kind of walk you through those. The first 2 are really around this idea of shining a light on others. And this kind of goes back to what you had said in my intro, which was so lovely. Thank you. About my propensity as now a founder and as a leader of teams to really try to come at things as a servant leader. So this idea of putting myself behind and shining a light on my team or on my peers or others. And so when we think about how that applies to digital and social media, it's really about thinking through, how do I elevate relationships with, say, partners or customers, clients, So those kind of on the outside of the company that I'm working very closely with. How do I shine a light on the great work that we're doing together or that they're doing, and I just want to elevate and bring more attention to? So that's one easy thing to do that in general shouldn't be too ripe for dissent or challenge. Now, I think the one thing to think through there, if you're talking about customers, is you likely have more than one customer or more than one client. And so certainly having never getting into a comparison game, right? You certainly don't want to elevate one customer while you're disparaging another. And that's fairly logical. Ideally, you're kind of balancing that light that you're shining on maybe multiple clients and customers over the course of several months, so they all feel like the love is coming their way. But another way you can use that notion of shining a light is really it's using internal stakeholders, but doing it in an external or public-facing way. And so this goes to really that hybrid of where marketing, communications, and sort of HR and employee relations come together. And this is around employees. So I saw some lovely examples when I was at Qualcomm where our CEO would share a photo, for example. This is during the pandemic, where an engineer went into the lab and took much of the sort of technology, machinery, and setup that he would normally use on campus, but because of the pandemic, had to bring it home and recreated it in his garage. Took a photo and shared it with our C-suite, and just kind of said, "Hey, I'm kind of wanted to show I'm still doing this. I'm still working. I want you to know I'm Team Qualcomm." And our CEO was just so kind of floored by the loyalty and the commitment to go to all this trouble that it was his idea. He said, we need to put this out. Let's make sure that the world sees the great employees that we have, even given the circumstances that many of us were living in 2020. So there's so many great ways to shine a light, not just on your customers and partners, but also on your employees. And when you do that as a leader publicly, it is in many ways worth more than a bonus. It is so valuable for them to get that public recognition by someone who maybe is multiple levels above where they sit. And it's the kind of thing they're going to go home and talk to their family about.
No, absolutely. And I just had to interject here because I was just thinking, I was writing my notes. It's like, if you have a company that's kind of struggling with employee engagement, would this be a tool to help raise that and boost that up, to be like, hey, look, we're highlighting the people that are doing great things. And that engineer, like, I wonder how many times he shared that to somebody else. It was like, hey, look, the CEO thought this was pretty awesome. And, and how many times you share that to everybody else, and that's getting the company's name out there too. So I think that's a really awesome idea of really publicly recognizing employees and bringing that to light, because that is a huge indicator that they have found in studies that the reason why people are not as engaged is because they don't feel valued, and this helps bring that value back to the employee. So I really appreciate that point. That's like,
I think you said it so well around employee engagement. Like, I'm not an HR professional, but just as an employee in companies for 20 plus years, I can tell you that, certainly we all have some level of value around the monetary component of work. Most of us wouldn't work if there wasn't some sort of monetary component. But for most of us, there are other things too. It's not an or, it's an and. And so that recognition, that especially public recognition, and especially by someone who maybe you don't have a lot of day-to-day contact with, feeling seen and valued, it is such a great addition to whatever your paycheck might be.
Let's talk quickly about it. We focused internally, right? We focused internally on our people. We've looked at our customers and our relationships. But what other things might we do to help project like a vision of the company using social media?
Right. So this is the third in the list of 5. So this idea of really establishing yourself as a thought leader. And what does that mean, thought leadership? Well, sometimes we use the term futurist, sort of bringing a futurist point of view. So most folks that are in a senior leadership, C-suite, founder level have been at it for quite some time, right? They've worked probably for multiple companies. They have made mistakes. They have had successes. They've had great bosses, not such great bosses. They've seen trends go up and down, generations of technology change. And so often by the time that you're at that point in your career, you have opinions, you have a point of view. Now, maybe you haven't shared those publicly. Maybe it's more in small groups or internally with your team. Or maybe you haven't even just taken a pause to write them down and really codify, where do I see the future of X? So this third one is around taking the time, which is part of what I do with the work that I do with clients, to think about what you value and also just your expertise and what it's telling you about where the future might, what the future might hold for your industry. And so this is bigger than your company. This is bigger than predicting what you think your quarterly earnings are going to look like. I mean, obviously that's territory you probably don't want to get into at all. But if you're talking at a macro level about a certain segment of the tech industry or a certain segment of the food and beverage industry, or you pick whatever your area of expertise might be, the more that you come out and really share a compelling futurist point of view, the more that people are going to want to follow and want to engage and be curious what you're going to say next. So I think this one takes a little bit more sort of time and kind of taking a minute to really define what you think that looks like. But once you do, you can kind of rinse and repeat it over the course of multiple months and multiple platforms, and then pressure test and see what kind of feedback, which is the beauty of digital, what kind of comments, what kind of engagement are you getting?
Yeah. So who does this really well? Like, is there anyone that comes to your mind that in the thought leadership realm or in like this futurist mentality, like who does this well? As I needed an example of what does this look like? What does right look like?
So one leader who I love and I've followed for 6 or 7 years now, his name is Scott Galloway. And Scott Galloway wears a number of hats. So he's a professor at NYU, Professor Galloway. So Prof Galloway is his handle on the social channels. He's an author of multiple books. He is a serial entrepreneur. He's got 2 podcasts himself now. He's a public speaker, all the things. And part of why I love him is because the topics that he really brings together, sort of that Venn diagram, are 3 areas that I love. So he talks about the tech industry, which is where a lot of my background resides, talks about marketing and brand, and then he talks about economics. So I love all those circles, and then he kind of merges them together. But he also is quite bold and at times flippant, and that's part of his charisma, right? Is sort of his sense of humor. But he does a great job of marrying statistics and data, which he brings in spades, with storytelling, which we know is really how most of us remember things, is through stories. So I love that part of his delivery. And he's also not afraid to make predictions. I mean, we just got through December, which I know is a very ripe time of the year for many thought leaders to be predicting what they think the next year will hold. But for example, I remember years ago, he was an early predictor of Amazon acquiring Whole Foods, which they of course did. And I remember thinking at the time that didn't what sense is that? Amazon already has grocery delivery. They maybe aren't exactly the same demographic. There are so many things, how are they going to deal with all this organic, all that? But he had great thought wrapped around it, and it came to fruition. Now he makes some predictions that don't come true. Of course, he's not 100%, but I just like that he delivers his thoughts with confidence, again, backed by data, quite a bit of logic and experience, but also has a sense of humor if it doesn't work out, and can be self-deprecating.
When you mentioned earlier, that it's good to get these out there, get your ideas out there. You have the thought leadership, and I really appreciate that really great example of Scott Galloway of if I want to know what this looks like, I can go there and take a look at it. But you mentioned about getting feedback, like you put something out there and then you get some feedback from it. So how can we leverage social media to gather those nuggets of gold?
Yeah, so this is the fourth one. And I sometimes refer to social, really, I mean, any forum. You could look at Reddit this way, any forum where there's commentary from the audience it's a valuable tool for feedback. And if you're wise, you're not just using digital platforms, again, in that one-way fashion we talked about at the top of the podcast. We're not just pushing out content and sort of walking away. We're listening. We're reading through the comments, and we're ideally, ones that are relevant, we're engaging, we're responding. And if we're really sort of, you want to 2.0 it, we're taking that as effectively market research, sans all the hundreds of thousands of dollars that you would normally spend, and at least adding it to the other data points that we have. Of course, that isn't our only data point, but we're adding that qualitative nature to the conversation into what we may do in the future, right? How it actually could change our product portfolio, or a new concept, or even a partner that we might embark on. An example of this that I love is Brian Chesky, so the CEO of Airbnb. He uses X in this way. I've seen it a couple times, where he will post questions to the audience about Airbnb's platform, whether it's from the host perspective, if you own a home and you're renting it out, or from a customer perspective where you're renting the home. And he will gather a bunch of comments and data, and a quarter will go by, and he will come back to that thread. And he will publish, I heard you say XYZ, and here is what we're doing to address those concerns. And I think that this is such a great example of not just using the platform for market research and data gathering, but really showing your audience that what they say matters, and you're listening, and you're doing your damnedest to actually incorporate their feedback into the future of the company.
I would imagine that this takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that. And I know it's going to take a lot of coaching too for a lot of people to do that, because especially if you're a one-man show, or you've got maybe you don't have a social media team, right? So I cannot, how much time does that take? I could see that would be really labor intensive to go through the comments and really gather that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, like you can imagine, this varies wildly. It depends on how many followers or connections that you have, and how engaged they are. How many comments are you filtering through? Often, a large part of engagement is really sort of the easy kind of heart situation. The comments are usually a smaller subset, because it takes a little more effort, right, for someone to actually write a sentence. But I think that like so many things, it's baby steps. It's how do you start perhaps on one platform. I often recommend LinkedIn for senior leaders. And maybe it's posting a couple of times a week, maybe even once a week, if you're not quite there yet, if you haven't had a history of exposure there. And then beginning to get into a rhythm, right? Maybe it's putting something on your calendar every Friday morning with your cup of coffee. Let me go into my post. Let's see what people had to say. Let's see if there's any patterns that are usable. And then questions or comments that I just want to respond to as a human who wants to show that I'm engaged and present. But it can be very small in the beginning. And then over time, if you have a team or you have a partner, then you can allow it to blossom and grow to more platforms, more posts, and eventually a larger subset of feedback.
Yeah, no, those are great tips to where do I get started, right? If I'm not doing this, how do I get started on doing that? So I call it fire and forget, right? I put something out there. I don't ever go back to it unless I get a reminder that something happens, right? So this is a communication. So it's two-way. and you're really helping for everyone listening to this or watching this, bring that home, is that communication is two-way. Like, I put something out there, you respond back, and I'm going to respond back to you, and we're going to have a conversation. So I really appreciate your points on that. What else can a senior leader do to really kind of close this into a good formula or format?
Yeah, this is going to be the fifth of the five, and this really highlights sort of the operational mindset that I bring. So my background obviously is marketing, communications, brand work, but I've always sort of had a strong secondary operational approach to things, and I kind of love looking for patterns and establishing systems to help make things easier for us. So one of the things that we did pretty early on at Qualcomm was my team, which was digital marketing, and our PR team, we came together and began to really think in a 360 fashion. So rather than maybe historically, where sometimes those teams can work a little bit like sister teams, but not necessarily day-to-day collaborators, where there might be, say, a keynote or a fireside chat at, for example, the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, which is a big, actually happening this month, a big moment for the tech industry. But every industry has these, right? They have speakership opportunities that often senior leaders participate in. But for a long time, those were done, physically on a stage with an audience, and they may have been filmed, but there wasn't a plan around how to, what I would use the term is atomize that content. How do we take maybe sound bites, short clips, 30 seconds or less from those fireside chats or keynotes? How do we, is there an audio version that can go out as almost a podcast or an audio blog on the company website? How do the corporate channels promote and then after share good shots and good sound bites, as well as the senior leader, right? Because there's two different channels there. And then how do we weave the messaging through, right? The messaging, of course, that person, that leader is speaking to on stage should also be mimicked or at least sort of anchored in their social content, in video that they make for internal or external audiences, on podcasts like this, right? That messaging should really be that red thread through all the different places they can communicate. So atomizing every single moment, right? Like right now, we're recording a longer form piece of audio. I'm sure you'll do takedowns. You'll do shortcuts of this. You might take screenshots. You might have imagery. You'll use social to promote YouTube. So that's super smart. You're atomizing one big chunky piece of content and putting it in lots of different places in lots of different formats.
No, absolutely. And I was thinking about this on our initial conversation that we had, and I was really surprised by you when we first had a conversation to do the podcast. You're the first person to actually ask me directed questions about my show and my platform, and you actually knew information. It's not like you just kind of went on to one or two episodes and looked at it. Like, you actually looked into it and figured out what the show was about and how you could deliver value to that, which I was really impressed by, because nobody else has done that. Usually it's like, oh, this is my thing and this is what I want to talk about. And so with that, I know that you've had all this extensive history in corporate America and big business, but now you have your own company, CoPilot Communications. And I got a little taste of how you've kind of worked with people. But can you walk us through how you operationalize things with a client?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you. That your compliment is well received. I do try to do my homework just to make sure it's a good use of your time too. So I'm glad that came through. So from this work I've done at a few different companies, again, with kind of that background with corporate, sort of broader brand, social, digital. I actually had a podcast of my own back in 2018 and 19 called Social Currency. So as just a side project with a friend, I wanted to experiment and dabble in this audio space because I just love it. And then more recently, as you mentioned earlier, the kind of one-on-one coaching and relationships that I built with our C-suite to help them stand up as an individual. I have developed a bit of an approach, and I've tested it and I've used it a number of times now, and I know that it works. So I can walk you through. It's really 3 phases.
Yeah, please.
So the name of the company, as you mentioned, is CoPilot Communications. I kind of love that mid-century aviation sort of aesthetic, and I use some of the terminology to kind of weave through the program. So the first phase I call Blue Sky, and this is really the strategy phase. This is so important, and it's the part I think that a lot of folks might miss because it takes a little time. Definitely works better if you've got a partner who's guiding you through it. And it also takes just some self-reflection, right? Getting to know who you are and what you want to stand for publicly. So we talk about who's your target audience, right? That's number one in any marketing or communications brief, right? Who are you trying to speak to? And if you're trying to speak to everybody, to be honest, you're speaking to nobody, right? So identifying who is the most important subgroup of people and really getting clear on all the details of where you imagine they work, where they live, how old they are, what their hobbies and interests are, why they're listening or following you. So defining that target. And then of course, goals, right? What are 1 or 2 key goals why are you doing this in the first place? And get really clear on your why. And that can vary for different leaders, especially given where the stage where their business may be. And also the level of comfort they have in digital platforms. So from there, I have the leader do a self-evaluation about their communications today, which is always really insightful for me to hear what they think, how they think they're doing, and where they think their strengths and opportunities lie. I also meet with 3 other individuals that the leader provides to me. So I often talk to a peer, maybe it's a direct report, maybe a past colleague, people that could speak to the person's communications style. And that is often really insightful for me because I mentioned earlier, I like to look for patterns and I start to see those when I combine the self-evaluation with these 3 interviews. And then I do my own audit, of course. I look at whatever public-facing digital platforms, whether they've done speakerships, podcasts, social, if they've done internal videos or they've internal comms, could be email, even that they send to their team. I ask for them to share that with me. And I really do a full audit and kind of look for their areas of strength. And then also maybe some spots we could double down on as opportunities. And then lastly, in this phase, I look at 3 industry leaders. So people that are in their kind of zeitgeist, right? That would be maybe share a title, maybe work in the same industry, have similar years of experience. There's some commonality, but they're maybe a little more elevated in their communications journey. And so we pull in examples and we again look for patterns to kind of learn from those that have gone before us and pull in those best practices into this leader's narrative platform. And that's kind of the crown jewel of this first phase, is really taking all that research and all that strategy work, and we develop a narrative platform, which is kind of their roadmap for the next phase.
Actually, I love how you tied in the aviation themes to your face, because I was like, wait a second, I was like, these sounds familiar, let me look this up. So I was trying to figure out where the strategy came from. I was like, that's where it came from. And honestly, you kind of did that with me when we first started talking. You didn't do all the other stuff, but you were really good at hitting the nail on the head with that. So after you meet with somebody and you come up with a roadmap, what else could somebody expect in this process?
Yeah, so Blue Sky is that first phase where we establish that strategy, those themes, the tone and voice, and really pull forward the leader's values, because that's key. Again, we talked about authenticity at the beginning, and if that doesn't feel authentic to who they want to be, who they hope to be, maybe the legacy that they hope to leave someday when they retire or step back, they're not going to be incentivized or motivated to keep doing this long term. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, I call flight plan. So we go from Blue Sky to flight plan. So flight plan is really that this is where we operationalize. So we've got the strategy, and now we get into things like I do a best practice training. So we select kind of their their number one key platform they want to start with. And again, often this tends to be LinkedIn, but it could be other platforms, Instagram, could even be podcasting. And we'll do a best practice training to ensure that they know a lot, but it's not completely comprehensive. So we kind of cross all those T's, get their profile up to date if it is social. We then build out an editorial calendar. So, okay, we've got these narrative themes. We've talked about the platform or platforms we want to focus on. And now we need to think about, again, the types of assets we're going to use, right? So there's obviously, the written word, there's still imagery, and video. And video, we know more and more, is incredibly attention grabbing and prioritized by all the platforms. And then there's audio, right? What we're doing right now. So we talk about like the actual artifact, the type of artifacts, and we lay that into a calendar. Maybe we do like a 30-day calendar just to kind of have an example and start to kind of talk through, how does this feel? Does this feel doable? Is it too much, too little? Are we hitting the themes in the right proportion based on what's important to you? Are there key moments in time you already know are coming down the road? You've got a big product launch in March. So we need to put that in there, right? We have to account for that. You've got a speakership already on the books. Let's think about what's the before, during, and after to really, like I said, atomize and leverage that. So that all goes into a calendar. Then we move on to measurement. I'm a big believer in, again, having just a few things that you measure. So 3 to 5, maybe at the most. And also the notion that what we measure is often what matters. And conversely, what matters should be measured. So starting with just even a baseline, right? How, things, it could be like engagement rate. It could be like views or listens to a YouTube or a podcast interview. We would decide that together. It could be qualitative. It could be the sentiment that they're seeing or lack of sentiment. And they really want to get more qualitative commentary and conversation. But we establish a set of goals and we put it into a dashboard and we have kind of that baseline. And then we know each month or each quarter, we're going to go back and remeasure and look at our progress over time to ensure we're dialing up and dialing down that content creation to really drive those metrics. And then lastly, I would ask, and often this is the case, again, if they've got a team underneath them, who else should know about this? Often I've been working one-on-one with this person now for a month, maybe 2. And they might have a chief of staff. They might have a communications team in-house. They might have a right-hand man or woman that's sort of their partner in crime if they're a founder. And they want this work to be shared with those individuals. So A, they're just aware of what's going on. But B, it might be that those people are going to actually help support them in an ongoing fashion. So I would certainly pull together a more synthesized, summarized version of this blue sky and flight plan. And I would offer to present that and walk those individuals through so that their key members and their team are really set up for success. And it's not just ending with the senior leader.
That sounds incredibly detailed and awesome because I love details because like you said, what gets measured is important and, and what you should be focusing on and doing. So it's great. I love the fact that you actually provide measurement back to people as far as feedback and kind of take a look at all those things. Now, I was just curious, who in your mind, I know that you're passionate about this and I know that you love doing it. So I would say, what is your favorite client to work with? If you had to pick a client, what would be your favorite ideal client to work with?
My ideal client would be one that is curious and willing to experiment. I think a reason that I had some early success back in the day of even Adidas and Microsoft when social was still fairly nascent was that I had leaders, right? I had managers that were willing to give me a lot of room to play and experiment. So I want a client who's also open. And knowing that we're not going to get everything perfect, and that's okay. That's part of the beauty of digital, is that things are always changeable. 2, someone who, and I would imagine this is the kind of person who would be attracted to the work I do anyway, but someone who has some level of self-awareness, right? They've thought a bit about how do I want to lead? How do I want to publicly talk about the things that are meaningful to me as a leader? And what kind of legacy do I want to leave when I'm done? Because more and more our legacy is going to be a digital footprint. And so if we don't spend time in those spaces, if we don't curate and cultivate that voice, frankly, somebody else will do it for us. And then that legacy might not be quite what we had intended. So I love someone who's self-aware and is interested in kind of digging in on a bit of the psychology that really plays into how we do business and how we lead teams.
How can people find you? I know we're going to provide all the links and everything else in the description on all the different platforms we're going to release this on, but how can people find you and get in touch?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my website is copilotcommunications.com. So you can go to the site. You can contact me directly through the site. You can also set up time if you want to just chat about your business or your platform. And you can find out a bit more about the services that I provide and my background professionally. So copilotcommunications.com.
I want to leave you with the last word. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you're like, you know what, I really want to say this last word on this topic? Is there anything that's burning that you're like, you know what, I probably should have said this, but I didn't?
I think one of the beautiful things that's come out of the pandemic era, which we're still unpacking and unfolding in 2025, is the meshing together of our personal and our professional lives. And I know for some folks that isn't necessarily what they want. They sort of, the compartmentalization and the separation can be healthy at times. And we all need some of that. But I have always, even early on in my career, I've always felt like this sort of bifurcation of who we are at work inside of this tall glass building and who we are at home with our friends and family at the dinner table, that they shouldn't be entirely different people. That the idea of bringing more of your true self to work, and then even bringing things that you're learning at work home to your kids, right? Or your family as learnings and lessons. I do that all the time with my daughters. And so I think the pandemic, because of the forced sort of work from home for the last couple of years, it gave people an insight into people's homes. And then obviously work came home with us. My hope is this really transcends into this work that I do. Because I believe that the best leaders, the most effective leaders, and frankly, the ones that will drive their businesses to the highest heights of success, are ones that show up as a whole person, and they allow some of their vulnerabilities to be transparent to their teams, right? They have some humility, and they also bring some of the sort of driver mentality and kind of the goal orientation they may have at work home to their families, because that can also transcend into how the other parts of your life run, whatever those goals might be. So I always try to look for the silver lining. And I think that really this whole self piece is a huge win out of the pandemic. And I think transcends really nicely into the work that I do at CoPilot.
Well, Jess, I really appreciate you being on the show, and I've had a great time talking to you. I know everyone listening to this is going to get extreme value from talking to you and what you have to bring to the table as well. So if anybody is curious, again, she's already told you by herself how to find her, but in the descriptions down below, you can find all her contact information. That way you can reach out to her as you need to, and that way you can further on that conversation and do all that. So thank you again for being on the show, Jess.
Thank you, Tim. This is great.
Absolutely. As always, thank you for stopping by and listening to this episode. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Before we go, I'd like to ask a favor of you, if I could. Could you please share this episode with the one or two people who might like this topic? If you haven't followed or subscribed on the platform that you're listening to this on, please hit all the bells, the icons, and the whistles so that way you know when we post another episode. I don't want to waste your time. If you got some value out of this episode, please leave a review or a comment so we can help spread the show with people who might not have found our show but are interested in the topics that we talk about. Again, thanks for stopping by. I'm Tim Staten.